Hello, I'm Michael Cusumano. I'm a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management and also in the MIT Engineering Systems Division. Well, there's a lot of hype around it, but we've had technological entrepreneurship for decades and in some ways even centuries. So there really is nothing new about technology-based entrepreneurship. That's how the Industrial Revolution started with manufacturing. But we've seen it with telecommunications, railroads, all sorts of technologies. So it is not new. What is new is the internet and computers, software have made starting companies much easier than it used to be, and also advertising your product or your service much easier. So that's new, and that's where I think a lot of the hype is. What I have been writing about increasingly the last 10 years or so is the role of services. Services of many different types, but if I have to look back at the last couple hundred years and talk about how has technology development or innovation changed structure of the economy, the first big change was a shift from labor in agriculture to labor in manufacturing, making physical products of some sort. But the big trend among all advanced economies is a shift of labor out of manufacturing and into services. And that takes up about 70 to 80% of all employment in advanced economies like the United States. So if you think about how has technology impacted the economy and labor, it's impacted the structure of where money comes from, where sources of productivity and gains are, and again, first for manufacturing, then agriculture to manufacturing, and then to services. So a big area today is to figure out how to make services more productive rather than labor intensive. So again, we see a lot of innovation in software tools, automated services, for example, taking buying and selling of stocks or banking operations or airlines, and taking that away from people doing it that you hire to providing tools, internet-based software tools for people to do that work themselves. And this is all around innovation and services. And we have many more of these kinds of startup companies coming up. Airbnb, for example, or Uber, which are providing services in sharing economy of rooms or taxi services. So there's a lot of things going on. Most of them I put in the bucket of services in one form or another. I think history tells us that technological innovation is a democratizing force, in the sense that technological innovation makes products and services cheaper and more available to a larger percentage of the population. We also see innovation creating employment opportunities, and more than just menial or very trivial agricultural labor kinds of opportunities. Even in agriculture, you have a lot of employment that was created not in agriculture but in manufacturing, but to service agriculture. Companies like John Deere or Caterpillar or Sony in China. These are huge companies employing hundreds of thousands of people that make agricultural equipment, machinery, right? And then lots of software and services associated with those companies. So innovation not only makes products and services more available to the masses, it creates employment opportunities, higher value-added employment opportunities. So it's definitely a democratizing factor. At the same time, I think from history we also know that there's transition periods. So if you mechanize labor in agriculture, you're going to put a lot of farmers out of work, at least temporarily. So that's also happened in every country around the world. And same thing with services. If you mechanize stock trading on the internet, you put brokers out of work. And or travel advisors out of work. So there's a transition period, and in that sense, innovation creates disruption. But in the long run, it leads to much greater wealth for every society where we've seen innovation. So you have to be patient, you have to be educated. Education is critical because the more education you have, the more flexible you are to adapt and learn new things. So in the long run, there's no question it's a forward-moving force. Well, we don't actually keep a list, and I've taught a couple thousand students in the 28 years I've been here. But I think most recently what comes to mind is a company called HubSpot that was started by two students who were in my class, which is now called Software and Internet Entrepreneurship. And HubSpot has raised about $100 million in venture capital. It's kind of big, and it's going public sometime this year. And it's like a Salesforce.com, but for marketing tools for the internet. So they target small and medium-sized companies with tools to help them optimize their websites, to try to reach the right customers, and then analyze customers who come to their website by making them answer questions on forms, and then to qualify leads. And then they provide tools to help customers use the web more effectively, to write white papers for the web, or Twitter feeds, Facebook pages, things to help market their company. So that's one company we're quite proud of, and there've been a lot of others. Most of the others have been in software of different types, security software, or different kinds of enterprise software. Another one was a battery company, which raised, I think, about $1 billion and had a huge IPO, and then unfortunately went bankrupt and was sold to the Chinese. But it's still part of the innovation network. Well, 10 years and 20 years are quite different, but certainly the biggest impact we've had in the past 10 or 20 years has been first the internet for communications, and then cell phones, and the increasing functionality and capabilities on cell phones, what we call smartphones today. So clearly, I think 10 years from now, all cell phones will be smart devices, and that they will be computers, fully functional, on the web, accessing everything that's available to anyone with a computer on the web. Question will be, how much Wi-Fi access will there be? Right now, in a lot of developing countries, we don't have Wi-Fi access in, say, rural communities. But I think 10 years from now, probably every village in the world will have some kind of internet and Wi-Fi connection. And 20 years from now, absolutely, that'll be true. We also know that the internet can be a lot faster than it actually is right now. And it could be 100 times, it could be 1,000 times faster. And that's kind of a miracle of software and hardware. But 20 years from now, we will have blazingly fast internet connections through ubiquitous Wi-Fi, probably WiMAX or wireless mesh kinds of networks. And that will enable communication and access to services and products over the web, or education over the web, and advertising, and that is, we can imagine it today because we see pockets of it, but it will be an everyday occurrence then. And we'll also see use of that network in ways that we're just imagining now. Sensors on our clothing, or things like Google Glasses, and a lot of companies now have smart wristwatches, but they'll be devices that will be monitoring our health care, personal identity, healthcare records, financial records. So almost everything will be connected, cloud storage based, and at least in a communications way. These are advances that will require quite open access to information, and so there's also a danger that there will be security risks with this kind of information. So you may very well see some societies shutting down or putting walls up around these kinds of innovations. And we also don't know how some countries around the world will respond. Countries that are not democratic countries, whether it's China, for example, or Middle Eastern countries, or others that are run by religious groups. So there's going to be a lot of potential for changes in our lifestyle, but in the technology. But we'll see. Not every society will react the same way. Those of us that study technological innovation and economists who look at this, for decades we've always broken it down into different categories. So some technology helps existing companies and makes them more efficient. Other technology replaces existing businesses and products and services, and that's very disruptive. So technology does both. It enhances and it disrupts, and both are part of economic growth, and you need both. So there's no reason to use 300 people to build an automobile if you can design robots and then build the automobile with 5 people and do it in 2 hours instead of 20 days, right? So, it's disruptive on, that kind of innovation is disruptive on some level to companies that were labor intensive, but most companies that will survive, and I've written a lot about this, particularly in the last book I did, and I'll plug my book, it's called Staying Power. And it's really about this kind of thing, but flexibility is really important to companies if they're going to stay around for a long period of time. So don't look at disruptions as being, or technological disruptions as putting you out of business, but figure out as a manager or an entrepreneur how you can take advantage of these innovations to change your business or change your business model, but in a good way. So we take the disruptions with the improvements when it comes to technology. We've had the internet becoming increasingly available, and so that period, mid-1994, 95 to the mid-2000s was really the period of the internet, and then that created an enormous boom in investment in any kind of company connected with the internet or technology infrastructure. Then we had a collapse of that market, of that bubble, and that had a lot of impact. So I think the past decade, from roughly the mid-2000s to the present, we've been adjusting to the collapse of the internet bubble, the search for more stable or sustainable business models connected with internet technology. At the same time, we've seen an explosion of mobile devices, an explosion of new kinds of software applications, and again, mostly accessible through mobile devices. So I think those have been the real changes. This concern about business models and staying away from bubbles, but also wanting to take advantage of trends that move very fast, like wireless and internet-based smartphone apps, things like that. Anything cloud-based, which is really services coming off the internet. So there's a lot of things that are different in the past 10 years than the 10 years before that or 10 years before that. The worst part of technology is that we spread information or capabilities to do bad things. And whether it's nuclear bombs or whether it's hacking social security numbers or credit card numbers of 1 billion people around the world every year, which basically happened last year. I mean, so, and this is all enabled by technology, right? So, and then we have, the potential for bioterrorism too. But I guess what would worry me most as being a software person, for the most part, is just all the criminal conduct that goes on with the internet. And the internet is best used as an open system. And if you start having to put up walls and complex cryptography, and it just puts up a lot of barriers to the free flow of information and access to information, which is useful to a lot of innovation. So I worry a lot about criminal activity on the internet, and which are threats to all of our security. It's hard to be a teacher and not be an optimist, right? If I believe the future would be worse than the present or the past, it would be very difficult to teach. So, I think I'm kind of a realist, but I think we've seen wonderful improvements in technology over the past 150 years. I was trained initially as a historian, so I've studied ancient Greek science, and as well as medieval science, industrial revolution, as well as modern 20th century, 21st century technology and the software business and software engineering. So there's no doubt that technological progress has made our lives, or the lives of most people on the planet, a lot better than they used to be. But we still need to remember that even in the United States, we have maybe 1/3 of the population that is not so well off, and some people living in third world country conditions. We have a lot of people in other parts of the world that are not doing well. We have a lot of societies that have principles for controlling their societies that I just can't understand. One would like to think, and I think we have thought of this in the past, that there's a common language amongst engineers and scientists, which can give us a common ground to thinking about, okay, what is best for society and progress based on technology and science. But unfortunately, lots of other ideas interfere, and that is something I worry about. There's no question that we see a lot of innovation capabilities and investment and tremendous training in science and engineering going on in these different Asian countries. But I do think there is something lacking in these countries, and that is, I guess, the structure of education and the process of it. So in America, in the United States, we have a bit more of a chaotic educational system. It's not centrally controlled. It's really different at each local level, and families have a great deal of influence over what you study and where you study. So and we also have multiple paths. No one tracks you onto a technology or engineering or math, science track too early in life. And you could be a college graduate in English literature and then decide you want to go to medical school. And it's possible to do that in this country if you're smart enough and take the time to re-educate yourself. So all this kind of multiple paths and lack of standardization and some creative chaos that we have in the United States really ends up being a tremendous advantage when it comes to innovation. And that process and some other elements have really led to us having just wonderful universities like MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, and a couple dozen others in the United States are really wonderful institutions or platforms for innovation and innovation ecosystems and entrepreneurship and venture capital and all these kinds of things that have been around in the U.S. for 20 or 30 years or longer in some ways, and are now catching on elsewhere. But I think we are still ahead in that kind of creative chaos or process that we foster here. You know, we see some of that changing. If we look at the most valuable internet companies today, you'll find a bunch are from China, for example, because of the size of the market. So things are changing. But most of those companies in China are largely copying things that Americans did. They do them somewhat differently, and over time I think they'll do more things differently or better in some ways. So probably 10, 20 years from now we'll see the lead of American universities and companies reduced somewhat, but I still think we'll probably be in the lead. The good thing about my field is that it's constantly changing, and it's actually really difficult to keep up. So again, I guess I'm most defined by material I've taught and researched on the software business. If you're in the field I am and teaching classes on this, you suddenly have to learn about everything: advertising, healthcare, you name it. So that's kind of been the challenge. Every year there's something new. Just this weekend I'm writing about the hotel business because I'm adding a little segment in my class about Airbnb as an internet-based software platform. But you have to understand the hotel business to understand competitor threats to Airbnb. Or Uber, also writing about Uber, which is a piece of software essentially that sits on a smartphone, replaces the taxi business. So in my software and internet entrepreneurship class, we can view that as a piece of software. We know how to build it, we know how to launch it, but you need to understand the taxi business and regulation and governance and that kind of thing. So that's been the challenge of my field around software. It takes you into almost everything you can imagine, and it's just a real challenge keeping up with it. Well, probably the biggest idea, there's probably two really big ideas that have been part of my work. And one is that software product development is different from traditional product development or hardware, and the business models are completely different. So software products can be replicated at a marginal cost of essentially zero. And they have other characteristics that leads to my second big idea, which is about platforms and network effects. But any software-related business is different from a traditional business, and so I spent a lot of time trying to understand that. And the whole operation of how you even think as a software engineer is different from how you think as a hardware engineer, and how you think about products, how you launch products, how you market them. And the fact that software can cover everything means that you can create almost any kind of company that's sort of a service company but driven by software. So Airbnb is kind of like a hotel company, or replaces traditional hotel companies, but it's enabled by software. The software has to sit on hardware, and requires networks. But to me, I look at the world through a software lens. This is all, to me, software or bits communicating with each other in different shapes and forms. So then the second big idea that I've written a lot about over the past 20 plus years is the notion of platforms. And we use the word platform a lot today, but it's platforms are these mechanisms that bring different people together for some common purpose. They share a common resource. Most of the platforms I study are software enabled, but they sit on top of hardware. And they're different from conventional products or technologies, in that they create these network effects, or these exponential network effects. And that's a very different business model, but it's why a company like Facebook can grow from 5 users to 1.3 billion users in like a half dozen years. And it's this exponential growth of networks. And so we never saw network effects like that at that scale before we had computers and the internet. We saw them on smaller scales, like the telephone network also has network effects. One telephone is not very useful, 2 is a little bit more useful. If everybody has a telephone, then the telephone network is exponentially more useful. So we had telephone networks, we had telegraph systems, we had railroad networks. Railroads connecting into each other made each railroad much more valuable. So I have written about this. This is also one of my principles in the Staying Power book. That book is actually, I talk about 6 principles: platforms, services, capabilities, pull concepts, economies of scope, and flexibility. And those are kind of the big ideas that have defined my research over the past 30 years. And but I would put at the top of the list as I said, the phenomena of digital technologies, particularly software, and then the phenomena of platforms and associated effects.